Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining today's Chocolate 101 Valentine's Day special webinar. My name is Sonny Hughes. I am a data governance and tag architecture consultant here at InfoTrust. What I do during my normal 9-to-5 working hours is I help clients set up their digital marketing and analytics tracking to make sure that it is not only complete and compliant, but that we also are setting it up in the most efficient way possible. That's like the very definition of data governance. So that is how I pay my bills, but when I am not working at InfoTrust, I'm also an avid baker. I love baking, and that's because in a previous life, I was in fact a professional pastry chef. I worked primarily in Michelin star kitchens and luxury hotels. I even actually worked at a chocolate company, a Belgian chocolate company, where I taught professionals how to create plated desserts, chocolate entremets, as well as build actual chocolate sculptures. And so we thought that it would be a special treat this Friday before Valentine's Day to talk a little bit about chocolate. Hopefully everyone will be eating a little bit of it this weekend. And I know that a lot of folks are staying in because of the pandemic. And so as a result, I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about how chocolate is made, what we can make with chocolate. And then towards the end of our webinar, I'd love to take some questions and answers. Again, I'm a classically trained pastry chef. So if you've ever had any baking questions, or if you ever tried to bake something and you just couldn't really get through it, or you had some questions about how those sorts of things work, I'm more than happy to answer them. Or if you actually just have any questions about just cooking cuisine in general, I'm also happy to help answer those as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start talking about chocolate. We'll start with a little bit of history, how it's made, talk about actually the actual science that goes into making it. And then, yeah, then we'll love to take some questions afterwards. So when we talk about chocolate, what are we really talking about, right? We're talking about cocoa. And where does cocoa come from? Well, cocoa comes from cocoa pods. A cocoa pod is the fruit of the Theobroma cacao tree. Theobroma is actually a Greek word meaning God, Theo, and broma, food. It's the food of the gods. That cocoa pod is actually technically a fruit. So chocolate, when in its very base definition, is a fruit. But those cocoa pods, they contain beans, and the beans are actually what chocolate is made out of. Each cocoa pod contains about 20 to maybe 50 beans. And if you wanted to make a 100-gram chocolate bar, which translates to about maybe 4 ounces, a little 3.5-ounce chocolate bar, what you would consider like your standard size, it takes about 35 beans to make one dark chocolate bar. So you can see chocolate is actually pretty hard to make, and it actually is very difficult to get a lot of chocolate out of this one single fruit. There's a lot of labor that goes into making it, which makes it such a special treat. When we talk about like where chocolate is produced, most of the cocoa bean production happens in the tropics, and that is because the climate of the tropics is how the cocoa plant it prefers that climate, and that's how it likes to grow. It takes it about 7 years, believe it or not, to actually grow a cocoa tree from seed into an actual tree that will produce fruit. Initially, chocolate was it was initially cultivated in Central and South America, but nowadays the majority of chocolate is produced in the west coast of Africa, primarily in the Ivory Coast. And then second to that, the second largest producer of cocoa would be in Southeastern Asia and in Indonesia. You'll see on this map here, the majority of it is right there on the west coast of Africa. There are a lot more chocolate production happening inside of Latin America and South America, but not nearly on the scale that you would see for, on the west coast of Africa. So when we're thinking about how chocolate is made, right? There is what they call a tree to bar chocolate making process, otherwise known as a bean to bar chocolate making process. And what that is that the beans, they are actually the real key to success when you're creating chocolate. The beans are where it's at. That's how chocolate gets all of its character, all of its flavor. But if you were to try to eat like a raw cocoa bean, it would taste nothing like chocolate. It's actually very bitter and actually kind of a sour flavor. The fruit itself is not actually very palatable at all. But through a long process of fermenting and drying and roasting and grinding, you get what is kind of a bitter sour fruit into like a very delicious chocolate bar. And the way that starts is actually at the cocoa tree itself. So following a tradition of probably over 1,000 years, workers, especially workers in indigenous communities, work to harvest beans by hand very carefully. They can't really climb the fragile trees because cocoa trees are such small trees. So they use like machetes or actually kind of like a steel knife that looks like a large mitten. And that's how they actually snip off the cocoa pods from the tree. The fruit is typically harvested when it's yellow. And gathering the pods, the farmers will actually cut the pods open with those machetes and they'll scoop out the white pulp and the seed. There's again about 10 to 50, sometimes 60 seeds or cocoa beans inside the pod, depending on the size of the fruit. And again, the seeds are really bitter. So the only humans that eat them really are the people that are first cultivating them. They have to taste the cocoa beans to make sure that they're still fresh. So once those cocoa beans have been scooped out of the fruit, they're actually laid down on banana leaves and allowed to ferment in the sun. So again, this is not like what we would consider a manufacturing process. This is very much a process that still happens out on the farm. And so the fermenting is actually where the seed first begins to take on the qualities that we would recognize as chocolate. And that's because after removing the seeds from the pods, the workers will rake them and cover them with those banana leaves, and they'll leave them out in the heat upwards of about 125 degrees Fahrenheit. And in that heat and with if you just imagine leaving fruit out in a tropical sun, there's going to be some fermentation, right? There's going to be what's called a yeasting process. And the seeds actually begin to convert to acid and enzymes, and they break down a lot of the bitterness that's in the chocolate to produce more of like a chocolate flavor. After that, the seeds are then dried in the sun. And they're actually dried and then sorted by hand. So roasting these cocoa beans is a really important step as well, because now that you have these cocoa beans, they've been fermented and then they've been dried, they still aren't really chocolatey, right? They just kind of are like now just very plain bitter little beans. So the roasting process is the second most important process when producing chocolate. And it's an important step because it develops not only the flavor of chocolate, but also the color of chocolate as well. So the techniques for roasting cocoa beans typically need to be suited to the type of bean, especially the size of the bean. If you're familiar with the process of roasting coffee, it works the same way. When you're roasting beans, especially cocoa beans or coffee beans, they actually have a pretty high fat content. So you have to be careful when you're roasting them because the fat in those beans will get very hot and will carry over cook, and you have the potential to burn those beans. So the process of roasting is typically very gradual and happens over a long period of time. Once these beans have been roasted, this is kind of where the chocolate manufacturing process happens, because the beans are roasted either on the farm and then shipped to a manufacturing facility like a chocolate factory, or they can be fermented, dried, and then shipped to a factory where they're roasted. But by the time they get to a factory, they're ready for that stage where they're start to be processed. And what that means is you're taking these dry beans and you're crushing them into small little parts, because what you want to do is not only break up the bean, but you need to separate the cocoa bean shells, the husk from the bean. And so now when you crush these beans, what they are actually called are cocoa nibs. Just like if you were grinding up coffee, right? You need to break the bean apart in order to get the flavor out of it. So that is a process known as winnowing. And winnowing is traditionally used to be a very difficult process. It's hard to remove that shape from the bean. So what actually happens is the beans are run over almost like a grate that has a fan below them, and the shape is blown away from the beans. So all that's left are what are called cocoa nibs. Cocoa nibs are probably the first kind of cocoa product, or the most raw kind of cocoa product that you can purchase in the grocery store. So if you've ever gone to the grocery store, they have like a specialty food section, or sometimes you'll find them in the health food aisle. But they are cocoa beans that are just been ground up. There's no sugar, no added flavors. It's just pure cocoa bean that's been roasted. And again, so that part is called the nib. And so once the beans are roasted and broken into nibs, they're much easier to process. But the nibs aren't actually the final product. They're actually still considered the raw product. And so where the real magic happens is when you start to take those roasted nibs and you grind them into a paste. This is typically mechanically done between two grinding stones, and it's a whole process of refining and mixing those cocoa beans in that machine. What happens though, what's really special about it is when you take these dry, kind of crumbly beans and you start grinding them, the pressure and the friction of the grinding stones helps to melt the natural fat inside of a cocoa bean. It's good to call out here, and we'll talk about it a little later on in our webinar as well, that the cocoa bean is actually about 55% cocoa butter. So if you were to look at a bean and look at its percentage composition, 55% of it is going to be pure cocoa butter. And then the other 45% would be the kind of solids that you would consider, kind of mixed into the bean. Same way as if you were to try to grind up peanut butter, for instance, right? You create peanut butter, you always have like the actual peanut oil, and then there's like these peanut solids that are suspended in the oil. Chocolate works the same way. It's very much just like the peanut is a bean that can be ground, the chocolate is a bean that can be ground. So this grinding process creates a product that's called chocolate liquor. And what that is actually ground up chocolate that is warm from the stone grinders. And the grinders need to grind that paste until it's smooth, incredibly smooth. And in fact, it needs to be so smooth that the human palate can't pick up the actual noticeable particle sizes. So it has to be below a threshold of 30 microns is the threshold for how small the chocolate particles need to be before you can say that this chocolate liquor is ready to be shipped on to the next stage of the process. And so once it's been put into chocolate liquor, that mixture is then moved into another stage called conching. And conching kind of is a weird word, right, for what you're doing to this chocolate. And it's because initially this process happened in a very, very large Spanish pot, hundreds of years ago, that looked very much like a conch shell. But what this is doing is you're actually kneading the chocolate liquor, right? It's still in a liquid form, but it's still very thick. And what the conching does is it allows volatile compounds to evaporate out of the chocolate. Again, after roasting, you've developed a lot of volatile compounds, as well as also a lot of the compounds that are just left over from the fermentation process. And so after you've ground the chocolate down to a paste that would look pretty similar to melted chocolate, you need to mix it while heating it to allow a lot of those volatile compounds to escape out of the chocolate, to evaporate essentially. And that removes a lot of the bitterness and kind of an off flavor from chocolate. It's really, really important part of the process because it is the part where chocolate quits being a commodity product and starts being more like food. It's also important because it helps to develop the emulsion that is chocolate. Again, chocolate is nothing more than cocoa butter that's holding a lot of little cocoa solids. If you were to take that cocoa liquor and put it underneath a hydraulic press and press down on it, with an incredible amount of pressure, what you would see drip out the bottom of that press is golden cocoa butter, right? And what would be left over is this super hard little cake that if you were to take that cake and grind it up or just crumble it, it would crumble up and feel very much like cocoa powder, because that's exactly what it is. Because cocoa powder is the leftover byproduct of pressing cocoa butter out of chocolate. So at this point now, we now know how the bean has traveled from a tree someplace in West Africa or in Central America or in Indonesia, and how it's made its journey through the fermentation process, through drying, and then to the manufacturing process itself, right, in the chocolate factory where it's been ground down to a paste, it's been conched, and now it's ready to become chocolate. So at that rate, what you need to do is then turn it into chocolate by adding sugar and vanilla to it. And when you do that, you add it not only palatability to it, because pure chocolate itself is very bitter, but the vanilla helps to round out the flavor as well. It's typically a traditional, it's a European approach to add vanilla to it. If you were to go to Central America and ask for chocolate, not only would you not receive a bar of chocolate, you would most likely receive a drink, and that drink would not be flavored or sweetened or have any additions to it. It's just cocoa itself. Once the cut chocolate has been produced and you actually have now sweetened dark chocolate, you're still not done with the process, because now chocolate needs to be tempered so that it holds together. And you'll see this a lot when chocolatiers are melting chocolate and putting things together with chocolate, that they have to go through this process called tempering. And a lot of folks, it doesn't make a lot of sense why that needs to be done, right? You have a chocolate bar, you melt it, you do something with it, spread it out on something, and then you let it set and you're done. Well, The cocoa butter is a very finicky fat. It's actually known as a polymorphic fat, which means that when you heat it and cool it, as it cools, it starts to contract, and it has what are called crystals. And these crystals literally line up with each other, and they need to be not only warmed, but then cooled while you're moving the chocolate around, so that these crystals will slowly move their way together. And that's how you actually temper chocolate. If you just melt a chocolate and let it cool, you'll notice sometimes it takes a long time for it to set, and you'll get a weird patina on it, something where it almost looks like your chocolate is dusty. And a lot of folks will be really frustrated because they don't understand why their chocolate doesn't look as nice as the chocolate in pictures. And it's because it needs to be tempered. If you were to warm that chocolate up and then pour it out onto a marble slab and scrape it around on that slab to cool the temperature of the chocolate down to room temperature, then you would have tempered that chocolate. You allowed it to align those cocoa butter crystals so that when you were to dip a strawberry in it or create a candy with it, it would set in just a matter of minutes, and it would have a smooth, beautiful, shiny surface. So let's talk a little bit about the history of chocolate, right? We've talked about the process of how it's made. So when we think about chocolate, chocolate really has a very, very long history. It's thousands of years old. Indigenous peoples have been producing it for thousands of years, but Europeans have really only known it for the last 500 years. And so as the story of chocolate really begins for the Western world, it starts in the 1500s with conquistadors bringing chocolate back to the Spanish court. Chocolate, in fact, came back with Christopher Columbus, but they weren't really sure what to do with it yet. It was, in fact, given to him mostly as a form of currency and not necessarily something to eat. It wasn't until Cortez, the actual conquistador himself, when he entered into the Aztec city, he was expecting to find a village, and what he found instead was this magnificent city full of palaces and museums and an advanced civilization. And when he met the king, Montezuma, he noticed that this man drank an enormous amount of this chocolate drink every day. Gallons of it is what the legend says, that he would drink over 2 gallons of what we would think of as unsweetened hot chocolate. And so at that rate, they realized that this cocoa product was very, very important to these people, and that it was a sacred drink for them that they used during their religious rites, but it was also a form of currency. And so the Spanish brought this back to Europe, but again, Europeans weren't really sure what to do with it. They didn't really find it a very good drink. It wasn't sweet or anything like that. So it was a novelty, but it wasn't very popular. It did start to catch on in some of the coffee houses about 100 years later in London and in Paris, where they would serve it alongside coffee as well as another kind of beverage, but it was still an unsweetened drink. There was no such thing as a chocolate bar yet. It wasn't until the 1700s when a company based out of England called Baker's Chocolate made the very first chocolate bar. And they did this actually by just taking that unsweetened chocolate liquor that we had talked about before and setting it as a bar. So there's no sugar in it. And you can still go to the grocery store today and buy the exact same Baker's chocolate bar, which is why if you ever tried to bite into a Baker's chocolate bar, you'd find it's not very good because there's no sugar in it. And so that is what we would think of as the very first documented chocolate bar, but still very far away from what we're thinking about when we think about, say, a Hershey's bar. And so between about 1700 and 1765, that product that we would call chocolate went through a pretty quick transformation because the French started sweetening the product and creating small little candies out of it. And it started really becoming a popular treat in Europe. And then in around the 1800s, you'll start noticing powdered chocolate showing up, where they developed a way of removing the cocoa butter from the cocoa solid so that they could take the powdered chocolate and create drinks with it. Before, when you made the drink, it was actually pouring cocoa liquor with water. It was a very heavy drink because, again, a cocoa bean is 55% fat. So imagine just it was just too heavy of a drink and it wasn't very palatable. So being able to remove some of that cocoa butter made it a palatable drink, made it enjoyable to drink, and it exploded in popularity in Western Europe. It wasn't until 1879 that they actually created the first milk chocolate bar, because even then Europeans weren't too crazy about it. They still thought it was still a bitter product. But a gentleman by the last name of Nestle was able to develop not milk chocolate, but he was able to develop powdered milk. And by making powdered milk, you could now add milk to a product that couldn't necessarily have water added to it as well. So that's exactly how milk chocolate was made. They started adding this powdered milk to the chocolate process along with sugar, and it created the very first milk chocolate bars. And then by the 1900s, you started seeing chocolate become more and more accessible to the masses. Initially, it used to just be a luxury, something that only the wealthy could afford because it was an imported product and there weren't a lot of imports at that time. But what especially Milton Hershey was able to do was take that chocolate product and add enough milk powder and sugar to make it cheaper so that the common man could purchase a chocolate bar as a special treat, which is how the Hershey empire was built, is by taking a luxury product and making it accessible to normal folks. So as part of cocoa, when we think about chocolate, we always think about what one cocoa pod, but there's actually a variety of cocoa out there. And it's really interesting to learn the differences between these cocos because although they are the same species, they have very, very distinct qualities. So the original cocoa, right? The one that, when the conquistadors had discovered this cocoa, and by discovered, they had stumbled upon a civilization that had been using this product for thousands of years. It's that what they were really tasting was the Criollo chocolate. It was the original chocolate that was developed, that was cultivated in Central and South America. It's nowadays a very rare bean. And that's because the cocoa pod itself, it's a very high quality cocoa, but it's really subject to blights, and it can be very difficult to grow. So it's not a very hardy plant. So it did not necessarily catch on for mass production. It's also a very thinner and lighter cocoa pod. So it only really amounts to about 5% of the world's production. Whereas when we think about chocolate, especially if you were to go down to the corner store and buy a chocolate bar, what you're probably eating is Forastero chocolate. It's the most common. It's primarily grown in Brazil and on the west coast of Africa. It is about 85% of the world's production, give or take. It can fluctuate between 80 and about 87, 88, but on average, it's about 85% of the world's production, which is the vast majority of cocoa production on the globe. And so if you were to bite into a chocolate bar, you have about an 85% chance that it's going to be a Forastero bean. And that's because not only is it the most common, but it's also a very hardy version of the Criollo bean. And the reason it took off is because it was easier to cultivate. Nowadays, there's actually a hybrid called Trinitario, and it's actually a cross between Criollo and Forastero, and it kind of mixes the best of both worlds. You get the hardiness of the Forastero bean, so it's able to be produced in large quantities, whereas you get the actual, the rich flavor of the Criollo bean. The difference is a Forastero bean, when it makes chocolate, you're going to get that very classic, like toasty, dark chocolate flavor. If it's made with milk chocolate, you'll also get again, it's more of like a biscuity flavor, I guess is the best way to put it. It's toastier as opposed to Criollo, which is a much fruitier chocolate. Some Criollo varieties of dark chocolate, some folks can actually describe as being too sour or too fruity, actually, even if it's sweetened, because it has such a bright acidity, just as a matter of just the variety of chocolate that it is and the fermentation process. And so I know I've been talking a lot about the composition of chocolate. So I'd like to actually take a moment to talk about what exactly makes dark chocolate, milk chocolate, and white chocolate. Dark chocolate is what we would consider the most pure form of chocolate, in the sense that it's just cocoa butter and cocoa powder, which is, again, the combined is that chocolate liquor, with some sugar to sweeten it. And you can add just 10% sugar, and that would make a 90% chocolate. If you were to add 30% sugar and 70% cocoa, that is a 70% chocolate bar. And that's what those percentages mean on a chocolate bar. The percentage is the actual cocoa product that is in the bar. Anything that's outside of that percentage could be either milk powder, sugar, or additional flavorings. So I recommend typically about a 70% chocolate bar if you really want to have dark chocolate that is sweetened enough to be, palatable, but not too sweet that you lose a lot of the essence of that cocoa. If I were to take that exact same chocolate, if I were to take that chocolate bar, melt it down, and then put it into a grinder and add milk powder to it, I would get milk chocolate. Milk chocolate is just dark chocolate that has had whole milk powder added to it. And that, again, is the invention that Nestle provided to the world, which is being able to add that milk to that chocolate. And white chocolate's actually a very unique product. It's technically not chocolate. And although we can call it chocolate in the United States, if you were to go to, say, France, they have a law that says that you can't call something chocolate if it doesn't have any cocoa in it. And so, in fact, you cannot call white chocolate in France. It is because it's just milk, sugar, and that cocoa butter. So if we press that cocoa butter out of the chocolate product, you're going to be left over with some cocoa powder. If you just don't add that to the equation at all, you just take the pure golden cocoa butter that you've pressed out of the beans and you add milk and sugar to it, you get white chocolate. And so that's why if you have any sort of sensitivities to milk, or if if you have sensitivities to certain food flavorings, milk chocolate and white chocolate are probably what could cause a problem for that. A lot of folks know that milk chocolate contains milk, but not necessarily white chocolate. It's the same milk powder in white chocolate. Dark chocolate is probably the closest that you would get. And again, though, depending on your region, it might still even have additives. So it's always good to look at the back of a chocolate bar and check to see what's actually made with. The very first ingredient should be cocoa. And then they should say it's cocoa powder and cocoa butter. And then the second ingredient most likely will be sugar. But if anything's before those two, then you're probably not getting the best quality chocolate bar. So I know we've been talking a lot about chocolate, and I know we've been talking a lot about sugar. So it's also good to point out that cocoa is not necessarily just a candy, and it actually can be very good for you. It's the sugar that's in chocolate that's not great for you. But one thing that chocolate does have that specifically cocoa has is flavanols. And when I worked at the chocolate company, one thing that we constantly remind clients is that chocolate does have a lot of health properties if you remove sugar from the equation, because when you compare it to what you would consider, quote unquote, superfoods, chocolate's really up there, right? Like you could eat a ton of blueberries and pomegranates, cranberries, and you not get to the number of, or to the level of flavanols as dark chocolate. Now, I'm not handing out a lot, any sort of health advice here, but it has been documented that flavanols have been associated with good cardiovascular health. So that is one silver lining if you want to remind yourself of something that's helpful when you're eating that dark chocolate. But otherwise, chocolate is really there because it is a product that we all love, we all enjoy eating it, and it's also really fun to work with as well. I've worked with chocolate since I went to pastry school and I started working as a chocolatier. As a pastry chef, you typically need to pick a specialty field. You can either become a baker, or you create wedding cakes, or you can become an ice cream maker. I specialized in ice cream production, and I specialized in chocolatiering. So when I started working with chocolate, the reason I liked it so much is because once I learned a little bit about it, it quit being such a frustrating product to work with, and I started being able to make everything with it. So that being said, I know that we're at the halfway mark on today's webinar. So I actually wanted to see if anyone had any questions for me on chocolate, or if we could go back and talk about any of the slides, and if something was a little unclear. Otherwise, I'd love to take some questions from the audience on what it is that you're looking to make this weekend. If anyone's celebrating Valentine's Day and you're celebrating it at home, I'm assuming that you'll be doing a little bit of cooking and hopefully a little bit of baking as well. So if you're trying to bake something or you're looking to do that, I'd love to hear what it is that you're making. And especially if you're intimidated by something, or if you're not a little sure, I'd love to help answer some of those questions as well. Hey, Donald, I saw that you raised your hand. There you go. Hey, Donald, how are you today?
Hi, good. I was just curious, when you posted your slide about cocoa bean production, what was the source of reference for that? Just out of curiosity.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Let me go back.
Thanks.
Let me make sure that we got the right slide here.
That
it's
one.
this one here, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so the source of reference is actually, I'll be honest with you, I have not cited an actual source. I stole this slide.
Okay.
But my traditional knowledge of chocolate when I worked at, full disclosure, I worked at a chocolate company called Barry Callebaut. It was marriage of a French chocolate company and a Belgian chocolate company in the 90s. And they produce about 80% of the world's cocoa. So this is actually a slide that I used to use, believe it or not, to talk about where the cocoa is produced. And the majority of the cocoa product that they purchased was from the west coast of Africa. They were the leader of cocoa bean production. But at that time, we were very much sourcing a lot of cocoa from Indonesia as well.
I understand. I was trying to understand, what the best sources for understanding the flows of, well, where it comes from, how the value of cocoa kind of is established from being, from the grower to the maker and to the consumer. I was trying to understand where value gets added and where the middlemen are and where the primary places to produce are. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that you asked that question, and I'm glad that we can take some time to talk about that, because there is a whole hidden economy behind chocolate production, and certain chocolates are valued over others. And it has a lot to do with, like any commodity, where it's grown and the rarity of that product. I will say that for the majority of cocoa product that is produced on the west coast of Africa, that is going to be Forastero cocoa that is then primarily shipped to Europe or the United States to produce kind of our general commodities cocoa. You'll see, though, that those are what they refer to them as plantations because they're such large, almost factory farms at that rate. And it's not the most sustainable type of agriculture, believe it or not. What's actually not hard to believe that it's not sustainable at all. Because it requires an enormous amount of manpower in order to field those plants. Whereas nowadays, most very thoughtful and bean-to-bar manufacturers are sourcing cocoa from smaller family farms. If you wanted to buy a cocoa bar from the west coast of Africa, you could go and get a Hershey bar. But there's a couple even domestic producers here in the United States that call themselves bean-to-bar producers. There is Dandelion out in San Francisco. There's also a really cool producer here in the Midwest in, I believe it's Columbia, Missouri, a gentleman named Sean Askinosie, who started a factory. And he literally flies down to Central and South America and builds personal relationships with the farmers and buys their cocoa beans from them in cash. Because what he's realized is that if you build that relationship with those farmers and you create a more fair trade system for cocoa, you get better quality cocoa, and you also improve the quality of life for the people that are growing it. For the longest time, the production of cocoa has really been at the expense of the folks that have been producing that cocoa, which is why it was able to be produced at such a cheap price point. Nowadays, though, you can buy some really high quality cocoa from those farms, but the majority of the value that goes into cocoa is its scale. If you're able to produce it at scale, you're able to sell it at a pretty high markup. But if you're operating on a small family farm, then that markup is a little bit different. But nowadays, most companies are trying to be more sustainable about cocoa production so that they're focusing on a lot of those smaller farms and also creating co-ops of farms, because cocoa, like a lot of things, just in the agricultural world, it can be at risk of, because of climate change or because of blights. And so if we don't produce a sustainable system for sourcing that, it can become a big problem very quickly, kind of the way that they see the crisis with the Cavendish banana nowadays, because a lot of cocoa product is also a monoculture as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great question. Donald, did you have any other questions, or did you are you planning on baking anything or cooking anything this weekend?
Well, not this weekend, but I am interested in what people are searching for. How data analytics ultimately ties back to the patterns of production and consumption, and what are people searching for when they're searching? What media are they engaging in, and then how do brands connect back to that intent data to develop effective customer decision journeys and effective marketing relationships? So that's kind of my interest.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And There's actually kind of two sides, of that coin. The first one is that the chocolate world in and to itself is driven by analytics, specifically by data forecasting, because it is a commodities market. A lot of the value of chocolate is determined by how they can predict what that cost is going to be in the future, because it takes so long to grow it. So there's a whole world of data analytics that surrounds that. Even when I worked at the chocolate company, it was myself and maybe 4 or 5 French chefs. And then we had at least 40 or 50 analysts that did nothing but forecasting the commodities markets to make sure that they could stabilize the price of cocoa. But as long as the price of cocoa is stabilized, the other side of those analytics is going to be on the marketing side of things, right? Now that you have this product and you've created a sustainable system to produce it, you have to sell it. And so what a lot of trends are right now in the cocoa product, in the cocoa world, is that pointing towards less commodities and manufactured chocolate and more towards the boutique small manufacturers. I think most consumers nowadays are less interested in just buying a chocolate bar for the sake of getting something sweet, and more the same way they purchase wine. In fact, when we talk about the way you should shop for chocolate, it's actually the exact same way you should shop for wine. You should look into where it's being grown and who's selling it, and also if that cocoa, how it compares to other cocos that you've had. And so what we've seen a lot in the way that the product is being marketed is that we're going after a much more conscientious consumer, a consumer that's thinking a lot more about that process. Like most folks that are buying, food nowadays, they want to know a little bit more about where that food came from. And so it's very important for marketers to understand that when they're marketing that sort of thing, that they target specific audiences that have shown and expressed interest in other fields. So again, like if I wanted to sell high quality single source chocolate to someone, I would find someone who also fell into a demographic where they also are looking for maybe a one type of wine, a specific vintage or something like that. Clients that are shopping kind of at the upper crust of food shopping, because you can probably sell smaller amounts of chocolate at a higher price point at that result.
Thanks. Oh, there are other folks with questions, though. I might as well let you.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I saw a hand go up. Hey, David, how are you today?
Good, Richard. This is really interesting. Thank you for sharing your experience, and it's cool to see the overlap between these two aspects of your life.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Cool. I'm always looking for inspiration for ideas where I should find a new bar of chocolate. So I'm curious to hear if you've encountered any recently that have really just blown your mind in terms of taste or quality, and how did you find it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. So the way that I, especially back when I was a chocolatier, I was always on a mission to find good quality chocolate. I worked at a company that produced some of the best chocolate in the world. You can go buy Calabote chocolate at the grocery store. It's typically broken into big bricks and then plastic wrapped. And that's good chocolate, but it's not the best. And so normally what you're going to find are very smaller producers producing really high quality chocolate. So I really am blown away by how good of quality chocolate American domestic producers have been making in the last 10 or 15 years. Traditionally, chocolate was something that was produced either by Hershey domestically, or you could only buy fine chocolates, produced in Europe, because Europe had a culture of small batch manufacturing. You could still go to little towns in France and there's someone who's making chocolate by hand there, and they are the local chocolate producer. We just simply were missing that in the United States, because the way the United States economy scaled, over the last 100 years, chocolate just kind of scaled as a commodity like everything that was sold to American consumers. But in the last, I would say about 15 or 20 years, you've seen a small group of folks who, for a number of different reasons, most of them were just because they wanted to make better quality chocolate, started producing it here in the United States. One of my favorite chocolates, because it's so accessible, you can find it at grocery stores. I think you can still find it. You can find it just at like a Whole Foods if you can't find it at just like your local grocery store down the street, is Theo chocolate. It's an organic chocolate that is manufactured in Seattle, Washington. They have a factory on the north side of Seattle that is absolutely fantastic. It's exactly what you think of when you go into a chocolate factory. There's big pipes and tanks, and there's kind of chocolate on things, so you know that that's all it is that they're making. But what's nice about Theo is that they were making small batch bean to bar organic chocolate before it was cool, before it was something to be marketed. And so they have managed to make not only a great chocolate bar, but they've been managed to make it consistently. That's a really, really hard thing for chocolate makers to do, because like any commodity, it's agricultural. So it can vary from year to year. So just like with wine, you have to blend it in order to create a consistent flavor profile. Theo does it best in class. Their standard chocolate bar is a 70% chocolate. Which is delicious for eating. And also it's really great for baking. You could chop it up and put it in chocolate chip cookies and it'd be delicious. 70% I always felt was my favorite percentage, because it was high enough that you were still getting a lot of cocoa flavor from it, but you still had enough sugar that it wasn't super bitter. Also, chocolate that's at 70% is actually about where that threshold is for chocolate being more healthful for you. Anything below 70% is gonna be more sugar than it is anything else. But I really like Theo chocolate, and I encourage folks to go out and try some of their chocolate bars. They make a 70%, and then they also make a couple that have almonds mixed into them and mint. So they do some flavors as well. If you're lucky enough to find their milk chocolate, they have a 45% milk chocolate, which is actually a lot of cocoa for milk chocolate. So it's kind of a darker color than you would normally expect, but it's really, really rich, and they lightly caramelize the milk solids. So you really, it's like a sweet kind of toasty caramely flavor. And so, yeah, I'm absolutely crazy about Theo chocolate. And it's spelled exactly like it sounds, Theo.
Cool. Thank you. That's really, that's cool. Definitely go check it out.
Yeah, you should, absolutely. The other producers that I like a lot are Dandelion Chocolate, that's based out of San Francisco. They make a really, really good bean to bar chocolate. And then if you can find Askinosie, which is spelled like ASKINOSIE, I think. He's got a very unique last name, but Sean Askinosie was a guy that actually used to be a criminal defense lawyer in Columbia, Missouri for about 20 years. And the way he tells it, he just had an epiphany one day. He just decided, I don't want to practice law anymore. I just want to make chocolate. And that's what he did. He took his life savings, much to the chagrin of his wife, and started a chocolate factory. He lost money for about the first 4 or 5 years, but then he was able to set up a sustainable manufacturing process, and now makes some of the best chocolate in the Midwest. He has a really cool milk chocolate that has made with goat's milk, so it's a little tangier. It's very interesting. And what's really special about Sean Askinosie's chocolate is that he's decided that chocolate should be very much about the product, but also just about the ethics of making it. And so he builds these personal relationships with farmers so that he can get the best quality cocoa from them, because they know that he's a trusted partner that they can work directly with. And he produces it. He's trying to create an economy in specifically in Ecuador, where he can produce, or he can source fair trade cocoa and increase the quality of life of the farmers that he's working with. And so that's something that's really important anytime you buy a chocolate bar. Chocolate can have, not all chocolate is like this, but some chocolate can have kind of a shady background. You know, not every producer is super ethical. But yeah, these domestic producers in the United States, I've Googled them to look for American bean to bar manufacturers, and you can find all sorts of them. And I really encourage everyone to go out and purchase those bars and support them, because they're making some really awesome product.
Great, thanks for the recommendations.
Yeah, thanks for the question, David. I appreciate it. Did we have any other questions, or is anybody planning on doing any sort of baking or cooking this weekend, and maybe a little unsure about how to do things? I love also just troubleshooting, and when I'm not troubleshooting data analytics, I love troubleshooting baking and pastry as well.
You're making me feel like I need to start making plans to bake this weekend. But, as of right now, no plans.
Yeah, you should really think about it. I've been doing it, especially because I've been just cooped up inside for the last year. I used to not do a lot of baking, and I've taken it up recently, which is why now I'm all about talking about home baking. I used to only be doing professional baking, and I could consult from that. So I had to kind of go back and teach myself how to be a home baker again. So that's why I'm so eager to answer those questions. Enrique, I just saw that you raised your hand. Did you have a question? Oh, I think you might be muted. There you go.
I'm sorry. I'm probably going to have to run. I'll probably miss the answer because I got to pick up my kid from my son from daycare. But does anyone recreate pre-Hispanic uses of chocolate, and do you like them?
Yes, I love them. They do. It's really hard to find them here in the United States. You'd have to go down to Mexico, and there's a ton of producers down there because they're really trying to reconnect with that original chocolate recipe. So if you were to go down, especially into the deep south part of Mexico, you'll have very small producers that I think are only producing domestically in Mexico right now, making the traditional style of cocoa where someone is taking like a grinding stone and grinding the cocoa by hand. I don't know of any off the top of my head here in the US that you could buy because they're kind of a specialty product, but there are people that are making what are known as pre-Columbian cocoa products, because I think especially because it is so integral to Mexican identity. The cocoa is something that was unique to just that country for the longest time. It was cultivated in other parts of Central and South America, but it's really a Mexican product in its heart. And so because of that, you've seen a lot of Mexican chefs now circling back around and trying to re-engage with that cocoa. I think the best example here in the United States would have to be here in Chicago, believe it or not. We have a very large Mexican population here in Chicago. We also have a lot of amazing chefs producing some awesome Mexican cuisine. But actually, a guy by the name of Rick Bayless here in Chicago is really trying to bring a lot of that culture here into the Midwest. So he's actually created, he has a bar, I think it's called Zoco, Z-O-C-O. And he's actually making the traditional, like pre-Columbian style cocoa. They're grinding it there at the restaurant, and then they serve the traditional style cocoa like liquor drink that's unsweetened. So it's definitely not for the faint of heart, but it is the authentic, real product. And then they will sweeten it not with sugar, but a lot of times they'll do a little bit of vanilla bean, or sometimes more often than not, it's like a sweeter kind of like Ceylon cinnamon that they put in it too. Super good, definitely something to warm you up in the wintertime.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was an awesome question. Hey, Amanda. I just saw you raise your hand.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. This is very interesting. So I was actually kind of hooking into the beginning of the presentation on, the kind of the creation from the bean to what we know. As far as the chocolate liqueur, or like even back to the roasted bean process, are you able, if you know, to get any of those more commercially, kind of more at their base before we get to the cocoa nibs and the cocoa powder? And if so, with the chocolate liqueur, do they tend to add anything? And if so, what? Or is there any way to get that at a more natural state?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And there are various stages of cocoa now. You used to just be able to buy the finished chocolate bar, but you can buy, if you were to start at the chocolate bar and go back, kind of back in time through that process, you can buy the chocolate liquor. That would actually be like baker's chocolate. So the most common one that you could buy would be baker's chocolate. It's pure chocolate liquor. It's just ground up chocolate beans or cocoa beans, no sugar added. That's just one brand. There are other brands. If you're going through the store, you can find Ghirardelli actually makes what's called a 100% chocolate. And that is just pure cocoa paste. So you can use it for baking. That's great for making brownies, or you can make traditional style like Mexican hot chocolate with it. I would highly recommend Ghirardelli's product as well. Ghirardelli is actually one of the very first chocolate producers, and they still actually make a really high quality chocolate, especially considering how widely they distribute it. But I would say if you're looking for just 100% unsweetened chocolate, the Ghirardelli 100% bar would be really good. Theo, the company that I'd referred to earlier, the domestic company, that they make an organic 100% chocolate as well. You'll see it named different things. Sometimes it's called cocoa paste, baker's chocolate, 100% chocolate. In France, it's called pâte de coco, like cocoa paste. And so that's where you could find that product. If you continue to go back in time, you can get both cocoa powder, right, which is been separated from the cocoa liquor, as well as pure cocoa butter as well. And then if you were to go farther back in time, you'd go back to those nibs. So the nibs are just the broken parts of the cocoa bean. And that's probably what most people think of as the most healthful form of chocolate. I like to actually take cocoa nibs and like put it on my granola and on my yogurt in the morning. And those are actually, I think, probably if you're thinking about eating cocoa and wanting to eat it mostly for like the health benefits, the flavanols, and overall just because it's delicious food, the cocoa nibs are actually the way to go. You can find those typically at, I think, Whole Foods will sell cocoa nibs. You normally have to go into I wouldn't say like the health food aisle, but it's like the aisle where they sell the other cocoa products and then like dried berries and stuff like that. But yeah, you can kind of get products along the spectrum. Were you thinking about purchasing something a little farther up the funnel, like actual like whole cocoa beans, or mostly just kind of nibs and beyond?
Yeah, so the whole cocoa beans was more what I was interested in. I'm actually looking at it during its fermentation process and then for its fermentability as well.
Yeah, so that's actually really hard to come by.
Yeah.
Yeah, because even when I worked at a chocolate company, I worked at the world's largest chocolate producer, and even then it was hard for us to get cocoa beans. And actually the reason why is because cocoa beans have a the actual like raw, either the raw or the roasted cocoa bean. We used to have some, for example, like we would pull some out during like a class to like show chefs like what the actual cocoa bean looked like, but it's actually not really recommended to handle them because they can have like weird little bacteria that live on them. I know it sounds it's very, very strange, but a little bacteria loves to live on cocoa beans. And the only way you can really kill it is by roasting it. So like a freshly roasted cocoa bean then immediately goes into processing, because if it's allowed to just like hang out, it seems to attract this strange little bacteria. And so they always say like if you handle cocoa beans with your hands, you should always like very much wash your hands. That was a big surprise to me.
Yeah,
I just would have never.
That's very surprising. I mean, I guess, bacteria hangs out on fruit, and if it's a fruit, but who doesn't like chocolate, right?
Exactly. So yeah, it's actually kind of hard to find whole cocoa beans. Even when I was a professional chef, I worked at a luxury hotel, and one of the amenities I wanted to provide is like a tiny little bean to bar chocolate. So I bought like a stone grinder off of Amazon. It's traditionally a stone grinder that I think is used in India to grind up like beans to make like a traditional style like flatbread, but it works amazingly for making chocolate. But the hardest part, I found a chocolate grinder easier than I could actually find cocoa beans. It's pretty hard to find them, but I think you can source them. You can check online and source them. There are producers that will sell them to you, but they normally have to buy them in bulk, like in the actual big, like 40-pound jute sacks. And then they break those sacks apart and then sell the cocoa beans individually. Because there's actually a really large online community of people that want to make chocolate at home, but they don't want to make 1,000 pounds of it. They just want to make a little bit of it. So you can actually find producers that will sell you really cool, really responsibly sourced beans in small batches, and they'll mail it to you. Just because there's this growing community of bean to bar chocolate makers kind of growing around the US.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And that was actually, it almost stumped me because I was like, oh boy, I don't know if we can actually track down cocoa beans. But yeah, there should be online producers, because I remember that's where I bought mine.
Gotcha, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Amanda. It's great. Well, folks, I know that we only have a couple more minutes, so I wanted to check to see if we had any other questions from anybody, or if we can take maybe one last question. Clay, how are you?
Yes, Richard, I'm unmuting myself. What I wanted to do is respond a little bit to what Amanda says, and what it is that you answered in response to her.
Yeah.
Which is that it's incredibly difficult to find fresh seeds before they have been fermented, right? If you do want to find fresh seeds before they have fermented, you can go to a tropical fruit supply or tropical flower supply store that specializes in bringing things in from the Caribbean and from South America, and you can ask them if they can supply fresh pods to you. And you can get fresh pods that way. You can open them up. You will be able to suck the pulp off the seeds. And the pulp is actually used to ferment into beer and alcoholic beverages. It's used to make, Barry Callebaut now is using it to make a syrup concentrate, which can be used by bartenders and things like that. And if, Amanda, if you're interested, one of the biggest online communities which is dedicated towards home chocolate making is called Chocolate Alchemy. So chocolatealchemy.com, founded by a guy by the name of John Nancy, I want to say back in, 2004 or so. This is before Theo was founded. And he's one of the most influential people in the world in the bean to bar community, because he's the one who first started promoting the use of those little Indian wet grinders.
Yes, Clay, I'm impressed.
Well, this is my business. This is my business. This is what it is. This is what it is that I do.
This is amazing.
And so, yeah, no, it's fascinating. I've dedicated the last 20 years to researching chocolate and writing about it. And I just wanted to be able to say to Amanda, listen, it is an intoxicating journey. Once you get sucked in, it is a rabbit hole that you gleefully dive down, and you find little niches of things to just follow on. And it's been fascinating. I've been very fortunate. In 2005, Sean Eskenazi reached out to me.
Wow.
In his process of saying, I have this existential crisis, I can no longer, defend murderers, and I want to change my life. And I helped him get to his first trip to Origin in Ecuador in 2005, and went on his first bean buying trips to Mexico and Venezuela in 2006. And it's one of the great relationships. And one of the things I think you'll know, and this is where we'll end, Richard, and I think it's a great place to end this webinar, is that you need to be a real miserable son of a bitch to be miserable around chocolate, right? And so one of the really lovely things is that you meet some of the nicest people. I don't know where you studied pastry, but Richard Krause.
I've studied pastry here in Chicago at the French Pastry School.
So Jacques Fiver and Sebastian Canon. These are
absolutely
in the World Pastry Team Championships. Yeah, no, it's a very small world. These are people that I know. And
yeah,
it's just been a pleasure and a privilege to be able to be accepted into that community, because I'm not a maker, I'm an observer of the industry.
Clay, I'm absolutely dumbfounded. I had no idea that to me, you are a celebrity if that's the case. The fact that you know all of these guys. When I was a chocolatier, these guys were absolutely my heroes. The fact that they had the gumption to start up something that was incredibly difficult to start up, especially just being able to find the equipment to do it. And you're right. There is a special character of person that does it. It takes a lot of grit and a lot of determination to produce it, and just a lot of passion. You have to be completely crazy about Coco. I feel so fortunate to have you on the call.
You need to be completely crazy, I think.
Yeah.
many people get into this business because they are attracted by the romance.
Yeah.
And once you start grinding those cocoa beans and you put your nose into the grinder, and it's like, you're smelling that stuff, it's impossible not to be happy, and it's not impossible to want to share that happiness with other people. And then you get stuck with the reality of, oh my gosh, if I'm going to turn this into a business, how do I actually turn it into a business? And
that's
so
the hard part.
People like Sean, it's like a 12-person company. What it is that he has done in terms of delivering value to the farm and actually transforming people's lives, not only farmers' lives, but the people in the Springfield community within where he set up, is just, he is a true rock star. And I invite people to go and look for Sean Eskenazi on YouTube and look at some of his commencements and other videos. Take a look at his book, Meaningful Work, that he wrote with his daughter, Lauren. I mean, just absolutely, especially if you're at all interested in learning how to make chocolate. I mean, Sean is a fabulous resource. And then John Nancy and Chocolate Alchemy.
Yeah. Yeah, Chocolate Alchemy is exactly where I found that stone grinder.
Yep.
I was surprised when I was like, wow, he knows about Chocolate Alchemy. He knows.
And you can also buy beans from John.
You can. Yeah, I didn't know that John does John sell raw beans, or is it just the roasted ones?
No, he
sells raw ones.
He sells raw beans as well. Right.
Wow.
And
cool.
just a quick note, if Amanda's still on the call and wants to
She is.
Okay, so Baker's chocolate, all right, tastes the way it does, right? In part because the grittiness is because flour particles are bigger than the cocoa particles. And so if you melt it, you're not going to be able to taste the cocoa particles on your tongue because they're smaller than the flour particles. The acidity is there so that it will react to a leavening ingredient. Right? So Baker's chocolate is designed specifically to be gritty and acidic. Right. And I noticed that David said he once ate a 100% chocolate. I don't know if it was that one, but if you ate Baker's chocolate, you know, it is definitely an acquired taste. But it is in fact very, very close to a lot of chocolate that is made at origin, which has no sugar added, right? Because it retains a lot of the natural acidity, which comes from the fermentation process. Right. That's all.
Very cool. Very cool. I'm absolutely floored, Clay. I'm so glad that you were able to join today's webinar. Next year, you're going to be doing this, if that's okay. I had no idea that you had such a history with these bean to bar chocolate makers, and it is an incredibly small world. You've not listed a single name that I haven't recognized.
Well, I would be happy to collaborate if invited back to do this again.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, everyone, I know that we're a little over time. So I want to thank everyone for their participation. Thank you all for your questions. Clay, thank you so very much for chiming in with such amazing information, especially because, again, what you'll learn as you learn a little bit more about chocolate is that chocolate's amazing, but the most amazing part about chocolate manufacturing are the people that you'll meet while doing it. So that being said, I hope that everyone has a wonderful Friday afternoon, and that everyone, I hope, has learned a little bit more about chocolate. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address should be on the meeting invite. And yeah, reach out if you do have any other questions. And Clay, especially, I think we should definitely get in touch and talk more a little bit about chocolate as well.
If I'm live, I connected on LinkedIn, so you'll see my request to connect.
My man, I appreciate it. Everyone, have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much for your time today.